Hello and welcome to today's Finsweet Plus session. My name is Ruairi McNicholas and I'm a WWX developer at Finsweet. Today we'll be looking at how to integrate two-factor authentication into your Xano web apps. And it's any sort of system where there is a second form of authentication in the form of two-factor, or if there's more than two, we'd call that multi-factor, if there's a couple of authentication methods that you have to provide. So in a typical web app without any sort of multi-factor authentication, you have users submitting a username and password on the front end. Those get passed to the back end, which then makes sure that a user exists with that email and that the password matches up. And if that goes fine, if the backend is happy that your password is correct, you get an authentication token that you can then use to interact with the rest of the web app. So if you've used Xano before, you'll be familiar with authentication tokens, how you can enable authentication on endpoints so that users have to supply their authentication token to access the app and to use it. What we can do to enhance that security is we can add in, we'll call it two-factor for this video because we're only going to be adding in one factor is what they call these different methods of authentication. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a step where once their username and password are verified, we're going to create a two-factor challenge, two-factor authentication challenge, where in this case you have to enter a six-digit code from your app. That then gets checked again by the backend, and if that's correct as well, then you get the authentication key. So it basically just adds an extra step of security. It makes it a lot more difficult for a user's account to get hacked or compromised. If someone did manage to find their username and password, they now also need to get that two-factor authentication code. So it makes it a lot trickier for someone to gain unauthorized access into the web app or into whatever platform you're using. It's a lot more common these days. If you sign up to software, you'll often be asked to enable this. If you work in a large company, it might be enforced so that you have to enable it on certain pieces of software. And what we're going to look at is adding that into Xano. So brief bit more on two-factor authentication, just to cover it, also called multi-factor or MFA. So if you see 2FA or MFA, they're essentially the same thing. It usually involves a one-time password, which is often abbreviated as an OTP, or it can be called, a bit of a mouthful, a time-based one-time password, a TOTP, where the code changes, where it's time-based. So if you're logging into Facebook, for example, and you get a text that you have to enter six-digit code, that's a TOTP because they'll generally expire after a certain amount of time. So say, it might say your verification code is this code will expire in 5 minutes. That's a TOTP. And it just adds an extra layer of security because if someone gets it and it expires, if they don't use it quickly enough, it's gone and you have to get another one. There's many methods for sending these out. Common ones are SMS or generated on a mobile app, sent by email. Sometimes it'll, email you, here's your six-digit code, and you copy and paste that into the app. Sometimes they're done by what we call magic links, where you just click the link and the rest is handled in the background. You don't have to actually copy paste anything. And they are occasionally sent by post, believe it or not. So if you've ever signed up for Google My Business, where you get your business listed on Google and it appears on the map, they will actually send you a code in the post because they want to verify that your address is correct. So in the case of email or phone, that verifies that their phone or email is correct. It's an added bit of authentication that it does because to get it, they have to have access to the phone number or email that they entered. And if you send it by post, it's the same thing, but it verifies your address. So that one's a little less common, but it does happen. So we are going to dive straight in and look at this. I've already set up implemented, the two-factor. We're going to step through how it's set up, why I've done it, certain things in certain ways, and how it adds to the security of the web app. So over in Webflow, we have a login page, we have a register page, and we have a My Account page, which will just show the user's email and give them the option to log out. So we'll start with register. What I've built is just a very simple multi-step form where this section here is going to be the first part that the user sees. They'll enter their email, their password, and they'll confirm their password. They'll then click continue, and they will be shown a QR code, or you can also give people the option to manually enter the code. If their camera on their phone isn't working for some reason, they can enter it in manually. So that's step 2, scan this with your phone. And step 3 is to enter the authentication code. So each of these steps in the form just has a Wized attribute on it. So we have MSF, multi-step form, step 3. Step 2 is over here. And we have step 1 up there. So that's what's built out in Webflow, pretty straightforward. And if we go over to Wized, we will see that we're only showing one step on that form at a time. So I'm going to go through it here and we'll see it in action, and then we'll dive a little deeper into how it's built. So I'm first going to go over to Xano, and I'm just going to delete my existing account, or it's going to tell me that it already exists. And I'm going to pop in my email, password. There's a little bit of logic here where you will do like a check here to make sure that they have a secure password and not just 2222. The usual has to have a number, has to have a symbol, but keeping it straightforward this time around. So it just takes an email and a password, and it will create their account, save it to the database, and it then sends an API call off to Twilio. So we'll come back to this in a couple of moments and look into this. Twilio is mostly used for messaging and voice, for SMS, for phone calls. They also make SendGrid for sending emails, but they also have a API for doing two-factor authentication. So we're basically sending a call off there, registering this user, and getting back a code that they need to enter to set this up on their phone, which is this one down here. There's also very simple API call to a QR code generator where we're just passing off a link that will open the app and that will enter that code. So we'll get to that. That's a free service. You just send the link, it sends back a QR. And then in Wized, we just have an action that updates that image. It updates the SRC of the image. We can go in and have a very quick look at that. Show QR code. So all we're doing is we're using the action set HTML attribute. We're using the SRC attribute, which is the location of that image. And then our request is returning the URL to that image. And we're just popping that in there. Next step, I will take out my phone, and you can use Google Authenticator. You can use Authy. You can use any 2FA app. I like Authy because it saves all of your codes and backs them up. So if your phone was to get lost, you'd still have access to all your codes. So I'm just going to scan that. And you'll probably have seen this a million times before. It's going to ask me to give it a name, and it's going to give me my code. So I will click continue. It'll ask me to enter the code in here. If it's wrong, it's going to display a little error. If it's correct, it's going to set up 2FA in the background and redirect me to my account page. Bingo. Okay, so very simple setup there. I'm going to just do login now as well. So I'm going to go back over to my account because I have a little log out button, and I'm going to do the same thing. going to log in. It's going to verify my password in the backend, and then it's going to ask me for my code. And it's going to let me in to the app. So that's it on the surface. There's nothing crazy or complicated being done in Wized. There's some spinners that show when you're logging in when the request is processing. If the login request comes back as a success, we have a counter in here for our multi-step form, and that gets changed to 2. That's pretty much it. There's nothing too complicated being done in here. There's a couple of requests. There's some actions that happen depending on if the quest is a success or not, and then it redirects people to the My Account page. So we'll start off in Xano with the users table. So again, we're keeping this very simple. We have created at, we have their email and their password. We have a text field called identity. And what we do when we create a new user is we generate a unique UUID here. And Twilio is going to use that to identify that user when they try to log in and when we generate the two-factor challenge. TOTP here is, oh, oops, I didn't want to make any record. That is again storing a code in here for Twilio to use, and we're just tracking if they have that set up or not, so that if they went through that first registration part but didn't finish two-factor, we could track that here. So if they tried to log in and this isn't set up, it says you need to finish setting up two-factor authentication. We then have another object here, TOTP session, which is used when someone first logs in to track that they entered their email and password correctly. But we'll get into that in a little bit of further detail. So that's all that's needed. These 3 fields here, we don't actually need that TOTP status one. I moved that into that setup box, but that's all that's needed in the database. We have a text field and we have 2 objects in here. Over in our API calls, if we go into users, so the first thing a user is going to do is they're going to register. And we'll walk through this endpoint and just see exactly how it's set up. So this is taking the email and password. So when someone is on our register page, we are sending through their email and password from this field through to Xano. First, we're just checking to make sure that there isn't an existing user. It's going to fail if someone tries to sign up with an email that's already in use. If there isn't an existing user, we're good to go ahead. And first thing we're doing is creating a variable called identity. And we're putting in a value of now timestamp, and we are generating a UUID, which is the universally unique identifier. And that basically just makes sure that we get long string in this format that is unique. And we generate that as a UUID. And then when we create our user by adding them, we are putting in created at now, their email, their password, and we are saving this identity value because that's going to be their identity for the two-factor system. So that's the first step, creating the user. The second then is we have a custom function to generate that two-factor request for the first time. So this is pretty simple. All it is doing is passing in the user's email. We are using that to get the user, and we're then making our first API request to Twilio. So there is a URL for this. Twilio basically have a quick start guide that goes through everything you need to set up these endpoints. So this will be in the video when it gets posted on YouTube, and that's basically going to walk you through setting up this endpoint. We have to save a couple of environment variables. So when you first sign up to Twilio, they're going to give you your test key for doing test calls. They're going to give you your live key. So we're basically just adding in our live key, and we're adding in the identity that we just created for that user with the UUID. And that is going to just go off to Twilio, and it's going to register that user. and return that code that they need to enter into their phone to set this up for the first time. We're also passing in what's called the friendly name. So when I scan this QR code with my phone, it's going to say WWX2FA Ruairi.McNicholas at Finsweet.com. So when it's set up in the user's phone, they see the site name, which is set up in Twilio, and they also see their email. So that's just adding that on so that their email it's not required. It's just a display thing. It means that if I go into the Authy app, it has the site name and my email to find it easily. And Twilio does different two-factor types. They do email and phone, and they do this app one, TOTP. So we're just telling it which one we want to use, and then we're just sending off our Twilio account identifier. So Twilio is going to come back with the code that we need to turn into a QR code. So immediately below this, we have a API request to qrserver.com. This is basically just a free endpoint that lets you create a QR code. And data equals is getting passed in from our Twilio response. So the API request there returns as TOTP. And we're going into TOTP, into response result, binding, and then URI is the part of the request that we need. But again, all of that gets covered in this quick start document. And that's pretty much it for the first part. Twilio gives us the URI. This turns it into a QR code. And we then go into the user's record and we add this SID. So once you first set them up with their identity, it's also going to ask you in the future for this SID for that user. That just gets saved there, gets stored in the database. And we are then returning the TOTP secret, which is what gets displayed underneath the QR code. That's the manual code that they can enter. And we are returning the QR code. And we're then displaying those in Wized. User then scans it with their phone and proceeds to the next step. So that's the first part. Generating or creating the user, creating their Twilio information, so sending off their identifier that we created up here, getting back their SID and the QR code. The last part here is we're creating a 2FA secret. So to make this secure, we're doing something a little extra here, where we create the user and we then generate a secret token. So if you've done SendGrid Magic Link with Xano before, where someone wants to verify their account and they have to click a link in their email, this is what that uses. So what it does is it generates a token for the user. If I go back to the start here, delete those and create a new email. So what we're doing here is we're generating a secret token that the user then needs to submit when they do the next step. What I did when I first set this up is when I created a user, I created an authentication token and I sent that back to the user. And then I then required that when they did the QR code step, when they went in to verify it. The problem with that is with Xano, your authentication token is essentially your key to the rest of the app. So a clever user with tech experience could go through to this point, and if I was returning an authentication code or authentication token, they could get that out. They could save it, they could set it up manually as a cookie, and they could then access the rest of the application without having to do this step. Or on login, they could get into the application without having to go past the two-factor part, which defeats the purpose of it. Now, you could set up checks in the rest of your Xano app so that it checked for their authentication token and that they had done the two-factor step. But in my mind, at least, that kind of defeats the purpose of using the authentication token. I only want to give a user an authentication token if they have passed all steps to get into the app, not just their password and their email. So what we do is we generate a token which is using the password function in Xano. So that's just going to generate a random character, a random string, 12 characters long, and it's going to create a variable out of that, where we take that token that we generated, we create an expiration date of 300 seconds, and we track if it's used or not. So over in the database for my record, if I go into TOTP session, we have our token, we have our expiry date, and we have whether it's used or not. And basically, this is created immediately after they register their account. This is created. And when they put in their QR code, they have to enter this as well. And this is all handled in the background by Wized. It's just a security precaution in case anyone tries to mess around with it. And in a way, this is kind of like an OTP or a TOTP, a time-sensitive one-time password, because it is kind of like a password, even though the user isn't using it, and it has an expiry date on it. So when I got back my response with my QR code and my two-factor code, there's also a cookie here for MFA secret. And that secret gets created here. It's a function called JWE encode in Xano, which we use for encrypting and decrypting or encoding and decoding sensitive information like that token that we saw there. And that is going to get returned. We save that information for the token, the expiry date, and whether it's used or not. And when the user gets to this step and enters their two-factor code, Wized is also going to send off this MFA secret. So we're going to take a look at that. So we have a endpoint here called verify. And this takes 3 inputs. The auth payload is just the number that they put in here. So it might be 221453, something like that. They entered their email. That's just getting passed in by Wized, where they entered it previously. And then the JWT is this, the multi-factor secret over here. So that gets decoded. We just pass that into this JWE decode function, pass in that token, and we basically then just, I can actually get rid of these debugs from earlier. Delete those. We basically just do a series of checks. We make sure that the decoded token exists, that it wasn't null. And we make sure that the token inside there is the same as the one that is in the database for the user. So we're essentially just creating this, encoding it, sending it to the front end, and then passing it back in and decoding it as an additional step to make sure that users have to first put in their email and their password, and then we generate their two-factor code and verify it. So we just make sure that that's the same. We make sure that it hasn't been used yet, that used equals false. And we make sure that the code hasn't expired yet, that the expires timestamp is greater than now. So that's just a small additional security precaution just to make sure that people are actually who they say they are, that they have entered this email and password, and they're now fine to go up and set it up. Twilio then gives us an endpoint, again, for verifying that they have set it up correctly. So it is, again, it's sending in my Twilio SID for the account level. It's sending in the user's identity, and it's sending in their SID, which is what Twilio requires. And then we're passing in that auth payload, which is the code that they entered from their phone. So just to recap on that, they've registered their account, they've scanned the QR code. This endpoint makes sure that their token is correct, uses their email to find their record, and it then sends this auth payload off to Twilio. And then we are just checking, this is our response from Twilio, and we want to make sure that response.result.status equals verified. If their 6-digit code is correct, it's verified. If it's not, it'll come back as false. Last step then, we are editing the user to say that they have used that session code. And we're just marking that as true. And we're then returning the authentication token so that the user can log in. And again, then there's just a action in here in Wized so that when this comes back, if it's a success, it will also include the auth token. We may as well go and take a look at that. So 2FA success finishes. So if the request to verify their code comes back okay, we set a cookie auth token with the auth token that we set up here in Xano, and we then navigate to my account and we go off to the account page. So it's a very similar setup for login. Again, if I look at this in Webflow, I basically just have two screens or two steps in my form, and I'm controlling those again, just using the same variable, multi-step form step. And first part here is very simple, nothing unusual, making our login request. Not skip out. Ah, you must first finish setting up two-factor authentication. So this isn't a fully built out two-factor system. You know, there should be a message coming up here saying that I need to finish up setting up two-factor. But anyways, what I'm going to go back and do is just re-register. So I will delete my account and just go through the registration process here and scan the QR code. So in these two-factor apps, there'll usually be an option to enter the code manually. That's just for if you don't have a camera for some reason. So again, I'll just scan that and continue. Quest goes off to Twilio and we're good to go. Okay, so now if I go back to login, it is going to proceed if that first part was correct. So if we go over to our login endpoint, we have a similar setup here where we are not returning an authentication code or an authentication token at this point because, again, I don't want to give that out until I fully verified the user. So first part of this is pretty simple. We're getting the user, we're checking that the user exists and that they do have two-factor set up. So this is where you could create another flow where if they haven't set it up, you present the screen and they can finish setting it up. We validate their password, check that it's correct, make sure that pass result is true. And then we're just doing the same thing here. We are creating a secret token that we're going to encode and pass to the front end. And the reason for that is if we imagine that we didn't have this, we need to pass something into the next request where they put in their code from their app. We don't want to use an authentication key. If all we took was their email and their code from their 2FA app, again, someone with coding knowledge, with web app knowledge that has malicious intent, nice way of saying a hacker, could just find that endpoint and pass in the email. And if they got your phone somehow, they could pass your code in. And again, you could say it's pretty unlikely that they're going to get your phone, but if they did, and if they figured this part out, they could just put in your email and your 2FA code and get access. So we need to always make sure that these two parts are being used together. So again, we're just generating a token. We're saving it to the same fields as last time, TOTP session, putting that in there, and then returning that to the front end where Wized is saving it as a cookie. And then when we put in our code here from our app, we once again have a multi-factor authentication secret. So the nice thing about this is the user will never know that this is happening unless they come back in what's 300 divided by 60? 5 minutes is how long we've set that to expire in. So again, it does provide that security. If you were halfway through setting this up and you went to the bathroom or you went out to get coffee for 20 minutes and someone stumbled across your computer, they could take your phone and scan the code. And now, you're locked out. Now you don't have your two-factor code. You got to email the web app support team to reset access. This ensures that if you did step away for more than 5 minutes, it can't be used. Puts that redundancy on it, that it only lasts a certain amount of time. So our pass result gets passed back saying that it's true, and our JWT is being stored in our MFA secret here. The final endpoint, so this is called login. It should probably be called login step one. And the second part they have to do is they have to complete this TOTP challenge. And again, this is very similar to last time. We are taking the auth payload, which is just the 6 digits that they enter from the app. We're taking that JWT secret, that encoded string. And for this one, I did a little different. Instead of inputting the email, I actually encoded it in that JWT. So when I'm getting the user, it just decodes that and takes out the email. Just a different way of doing it. So again, we're checking that their session token exists. We are checking that it matches what's in the database. We are checking that it hasn't been used, checking that it hasn't expired. And if all those checks go fine, we're making an API request to Twilio. Once again, just passing in our own top-level account SID for Twilio, and then the user's identity, which we had saved in the database here. And we're adding in the auth payload, which is just the 6-digit code that they get from their app and their SID as well. So Twilio just looks for this identity field and this SID code as well. And then Twilio is handling all the work involved in checking that code, that 6-digit code, is correct. They handle all of that as part of their service. We just say, hey, here's the user's identity, their SID, and their 6-digit code. Is all of this correct? And if it comes back as approved, then we edit the user's record just to change that TOTP session from used false to used true. And then we generate their authentication token. And now, anytime that they're accessing our app with an authentication token, we know that they verified their password and they verified their two-factor code. And that is pretty much it for setting up two-factor for registration in the first instance and then logging in. Now, you could, of course, use this in other places. If you've ever used banking apps or if you've used Stripe, many of these platforms will have requests, that actions you can do on your account that don't require two-factor, like changing your name. If I change my name on Stripe, I don't think it asks for it. But if I want to view my bank info, if I want to delete my account, if I want to withdraw money, it's typically going to ask for the code, your two-factor code again. So you could set this up in other locations in your app. So if a user wants to delete their account, for an example, you could just link this in. You've everything set up in the database. They register and set up 2FA. They log in and enter the code. You could set up these challenges at any other point in your app where you want an extra security step, or you want to be 100% sure that that user is who they say they are. Okay, so for the last 5-10 minutes, we'll just quickly go over and take a look at Twilio. So this pretty much gives you an overview. You need to sign up for Twilio, and they'll have an option for their verify service, which should be pulled over here. Yeah, there we go. I'm not actually sure off the top of my head if the verify service is free. There might be a cost to it, but it's a very, very small. I think it might be like less than a cent per request. But anyways, they give you some free credits that you can play around with. The only thing I'm using in here is their verify service. So this is going to ask you when you set it up, do you want to use email? Do you want to use SMS? You can just ignore that and just set it up out of the box, and it's going to give you the tools that you need to get this set up. So if we go into services, you create a service per app that you want to authenticate into. So inside Twilio, again, you can skip all their other services and products. You're going into verify and you're just creating a new service, and it's going to give you an SID for that. And there's one other important setting in here that we will look at. So again, it's going to give you all these different options. General, you just are concerned with the name. You want to copy the SID, and then the code length, 6 is fine. I wouldn't change it from 6 unless you have a specific reason. And then we're going to skip over all of these over to TOTP. And again, we pop a name in here and the code length, the time that it lasts, and we then have an important number down here called skew. And skew just means how long the code will remain valid after a new one is generated. If I set this to 0, if you've used two-factor, you'll have had this experience of entering in your code just as it changes on the phone. If you set it to 0, it has to be the code that's displayed on the phone right now. If that changes when you're in the middle of typing it, tough, you got to enter it again. If you change skew to 1, it means that the previous code is also going to work. So, if I type in 111, and then the code changes to 222, I can still continue because it's going to use the previous one. So 1 is probably fine. It means that they're not going to have to enter it in again if it changes while they're in the middle of typing it. That's pretty much all you have to set up here in Twilio. Most of the work here is in Xano. It's a couple of endpoints to set up. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Register a user and TOTP seed. That is what happens when they first register their account. Register, they call it a seed. We generate the QR code and then we verify that it's successful. And then any other time we want to verify a user, we currently just have it set up for login. We create a challenge and update it to say that it is a success. So this is what I followed. What I will probably do is turn this into a Xano snippet so that if anyone is interested in just looking at this directly and setting it up for themselves and tinkering with it, you'll be able to copy this into a Xano workspace. If there's a lot of interest, we might make Webflow clonable, Wized clonable, and the Xano snippet, but for now, I'll just make this available so that you can play around with it. And that brings us to the end of today's session covering two-factor authentication. So in brief recap, we covered how to set up the verify service on Twilio and how to set that up on Xano with our secret keys. We set up the creation of the user's identity when they register on the web app. We then set up the QR code that they scan with their phone, and we check that their code that they enter matches up with what Twilio has. And then we just modified that slightly so that when they log in, they're also required to enter their two-factor code to get their authentication key in Xano. So that's all. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like on the video, drop a comment with any questions you have, any insights you have, if two-factor authentication has worked for you in the past, and see you at the next Finsweet Plus session.